There are over 100 cannabinoids found in cannabis, and more continue to be discovered. Each one has a personality, each has particular uses, and when they all work together, they are at their best. Federal cannabinoid prohibition influences the cannabis market in ways that pervert it to the detriment of everybody. Even though Delta-8 THC is widespread throughout the country, and many profess that it was made legal by the U.S. Farm Bill, it is not actually a legal cannabinoid. Its illegality is just not enforced. But that's not what we're covering during today's show. If you'd like to hear expert legal analysis on that topic, check out the new video clip from last week's Credo Science Delta-8 webinar on the Shaping Fire YouTube channel with attorney Lauren Ruddick. During the webinar highlights you'll find there, she explains in detail the legal standing of Delta-8 and clarifies many of the misconceptions. And consider subscribing to the Credo Science newsletter to find out about their upcoming cannabis science webinars. Links to all of these are on the Shaping Fire website page for this episode. Today's episode is about the Delta-8 molecule itself, how it functions, how it doesn't function, and why how it's made is so important. If you want to learn about cannabis health, cultivation, and technique efficiently and with good cheer, I encourage you to subscribe to our newsletter. We'll send you new podcast episodes as they come out, delivered right to your inbox, along with commentary on a couple of the most important news items from the week and videos too. Don't rely on social media to let you know when a new episode is published. Sign up for the updates to make sure you don't miss an episode. Also, we're giving away very cool prizes to folks who are signed up to receive the newsletter. There's nothing else you need to do to win except receive that newsletter. So go to shapingfire.com to sign up for the newsletter this week and be entered into this month's and all future newsletter prize drawings. Welcome to episode 110. You are listening to Shaping Fire, and I am your host, Shango Los. My guest today is Dr. Ethan Russo. Ethan Russo is a board-certified neurologist and former senior medical advisor to GW Pharmaceuticals. He served as study physician to GW Pharmaceuticals for 3 phase 3 clinical trials of Sativex. He has held faculty appointments in pharmaceutical sciences at the University of Montana, in medicine at the University of Washington, and as visiting professor at the Chinese Academy of Sciences. He has been president of the International Cannabinoid Research Society and is former chairman of the International Association for Cannabinoid Medicines. In 1995, he pursued a 3-month sabbatical doing ethnobotanical research with indigenous people in Peru. He is author of several books of cannabis medicine and has published over 30 articles in neurology, pain management, cannabis, and ethnobotany. Dr. Russo has joined us several times on Shaping Fire. Episode 22 on treating traumatic brain injury with cannabis and mushrooms. Episodes 11 and 27 about his famous research papers on cannabinoids and terpenoids. Episode number 67 about treating migraines with mushrooms and cannabis. Episode 80 on cannabis hyperemesis syndrome. Episode 83 on cannabigerol, CBG. Episode 103 regarding the life's work of Dr. Raphael Mechoulam. And of course, the Shaping Fire sessions on Shaping Fire's YouTube channel. During the first set today, we will take a look at the molecular nature of Delta-8 THC and its historical milestones. In the second set, we will learn about how Delta-8 is synthesized and how that creates complications for use of this cannabinoid. And during the third set, we will explore some of the lesser discussed attributes of Delta-8, including its propensity to cause failed drug tests and cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. Welcome back to Shaping Fire, Ethan.
It's nice to be here.
You know, I had another first this morning while setting up here in my office studio. Usually I can leave a window cracked facing the water for, the good saltwater smells. But today I had to close it because the sea lions have decided to have a party on the beach below my house. And, you can just hear them honking away. And I did a little test and you could actually hear them. And I thought, well, that would give people a little bit of sense of place, but also probably not appropriate. And this isn't the first time that animals have played a role in one of your Shaping Fire episodes. You may recall that 5 years ago, we were recording and I had to ask you to hold for a moment because my neighbor's cows had found their way into my yard and were eating all of my tulips. And so you were kind to wait for a minute while I shooed them out of the yard.
Yeah, the animals want their voices heard.
Totally. And this island's definitely theirs as much of, or maybe even more than ours. So anyway, thank you for being here, Ethan. And let's get started right off at the top. So many people refer to Delta-8 tetrahydrocannabinol as, D8, Delta-8. Everybody wants to shorten it, and everyone just kind of like assumes they, other people know what it is. But since this is a good, primer on what's going on with Delta-8 in the cannabis scene, I think we should start there. So would you please describe what Delta-8 is chemically?
Sure. So this is a normal trace compound found in cannabis. It differs from the more expected Delta-9 THC only in the fact that a double bond in one of the rings is in a different position. Interestingly, apparently the plant doesn't have any enzymes to make this, but it appears in trace amounts even in fresh material. And certainly under the influence of heat, it may appear in greater concentrations. So it is a natural component, and it is more stable to heat than Delta-9 is.
So that one caveat confuses me, because if the plant doesn't have a way to make it, are you suggesting that there is enough heat that happens during harvesting, that some amount of cannabinoid is synthesized into Delta-8? Or are you saying that we just haven't figured out yet how the plant makes Delta-8? Because if it's there, it's there.
Yeah, I think it's the latter. I'm not sure how it's doing it, but plants are very resourceful, and it may have some trick that doesn't involve the customary enzymes.
Right on. All right. Well, that's really interesting. It's always great when there are when we get to point out new research that's looking to be done for all the folks moving into the industry. So Delta-9 is the form of THC that we're so familiar with and humans love so much. How is Delta-8 different from Delta-9 chemically?
Again, if we look at the molecular weight, it's the same. In terms of most reactions, it's going to be the same. It does differ in its affinity for the CB1 receptor, the psychoactive receptor in the brain. And so it is not quite as potent, but basically most of its activity would be similar rather than distinct from Delta-9. And there's a very involved experiment going on now, hasn't quite been completed, by Ryan Vondre at Johns Hopkins. We have some preliminary results on it, but they haven't gotten through the full contingent of subjects for that study. So we will learn more, but there are more similarities than differences.
That really surprises me because, most people that I have spoken with say that, they'll struggle to describe what Delta-8 feels like to them, but they're always describing it as feeling different than Delta-9, which we will often, we will describe as a euphoric, right? And so, and it sounds like we'll get more to the bottom of this after this new study, but in its essence, are you saying that we're finding that Delta-8 actually feels pretty similar to Delta-9, except that it's more like at a 60% potency?
That would be a really reasonable way to characterize it, yes.
All right. That surprises me. All right. So it may have a reduced but similar euphoric effect as Delta-9 does. Let's talk a bit about the similar medical applications. Not only do we love the experience of taking in Delta-9 THC, but it also has got long heralded medical benefits of being an anti-inflammatory and an analgesic and an antiemetic, meaning anti-nausea, along with a whole bunch of other things. does Delta-8 have any of those similar medical applications, or maybe we don't know yet?
Quite likely, but again, there could be differences. There's only been one real clinical study done with Delta-8, and that was clear back in 1995. So this is a study by Abrahamoff and Meshulam. They used pure Delta-8 THC, so not what people commonly have access to here, we should say. They use this in relatively high doses to children that had blood cancers, mainly leukemia and the like. And this was given to counteract nausea and vomiting associated with the chemotherapy that they were getting. And there were 480 total applications, administrations of this, and it was almost uniformly effective in allaying the nausea and vomiting. The other thing that was interesting was they seemed to tolerate very high doses compared to that would have been used in adults, but that just highlights something that was known, say, in the 19th century, that young children seem to be resistant to the psychoactive effects of cannabis.
Wow, that's interesting. It sure is explanatory a bit around how we see young children use THC cannabis oil without, getting like really stoned. So many of the younger kids can get relief from their symptoms without the accompanying intoxication. And I've always wondered about that. Do we have any explanation for why kids seem to be able to tolerate that aspect of it?
Sure. Well, the tongue-in-cheek explanation would be that kids act like they're stoned anyway.
Oh.
But the more serious explanation would probably have to do with the density of CB1 receptors in the brain.
And what, meaning that they don't have them developed yet, and so they're not taking it on board as fast? Is that the point?
Right. So they're not as expressed as, say, in an older person, an adolescent or adult.
Right on. So back to the idea that Dr. Meshulam et al. Were using a large amount of Delta-8 isolate, which you're right. We don't have easy access to here right now for lots of reasons that we'll talk about more later. But this is normally when you've been on Shaping Fire before to talk about other novel cannabinoids, and this is normally when I say, well, if the isolate is good, does this cannabinoid work more effectively in a whole plant preparation instead of an isolate? But you've already said that there's only trace amounts of it. Is there any analysis to support that Delta-8's presence or not in such small amounts in a whole plant preparation has any meaning at all, any substantive impact?
The answer is probably not, and it was addressed quite well by a study that's now 50 years old, Carniol and Carlini in Brazil, back in 1973, actually did comparative studies in man, also in animals, comparing Delta-8 and Delta-9 THC. These were very carefully done studies that answer some of those questions. But because Delta-8 proved to be half as effective as Delta-9 in causing rapid heart rate tachycardia, Delta-8 was 30% less effective in producing impairment of time estimation, and it had less psychoactive value according to people's subjective scores, how they rated their psychoactivity. Mm-hmm. So their conclusion was, because of the low concentration of Delta-8 in natural cannabis, that it probably had very little effect. would be swamped by the higher amounts of Delta-9. And I should add at this time that we have no indication that we could selectively breed for higher Delta-8 THC concentrations.
So, I had heard that before, but earlier in the show already, you had mentioned that we actually don't know how Delta-8 even comes into being in the plant. So, what is the early signs that we're getting this idea that it would be difficult or unlikely that we could selectively breed for increased Delta-8?
Well, again, because there seemingly are no enzymes that would make it. There's been a lot of cannabis breeding going on, and nothing has appeared that seems to have significantly more Delta-8 concentration. So we just don't have a path forward for that.
All right.
And it's unclear to me that it would be worth the expenditure of time, money, and effort either.
Oh, sure. Well, whether or not it makes sense from a market point of view is definitely true, but also a different thing because, when you and I are here saying that, there's no way to selectively breed for increased Delta-8, that, if I was a breeder and hearing that, that sounds like a dare, and if there is some, established botanical reason, why we see a blockage in that path for breeding, I figured this would be a good time to bring it up.
Sure.
And I also think that now is probably a good time to say we're going to talk more about this later, but I can imagine listeners asking the question to themselves, well, then where the hell does all this Delta-8 come from? And spoiler alert, we're going to tell you during the second set that nowadays it is almost entirely synthesized from CBD, cannabidiol. So we'll answer that question now, but we'll get into that more during the second set. So Ethan, if Delta-8 is less potent than Delta-9 and the high is not as delightful and the medicinal benefit isn't as substantial, it seems to me that there is an obvious market reason why such an inferior cannabinoid is being used in so many states in place of simply using traditional Delta-9 cannabis. What is that reason?
Well, first, I'm not sure I'd use the word inferior. It is inferior from the standpoint of quality control. And really the issue with Delta-8 is that it is synthesized, that the material that's produced is not pure, that there can be all these byproducts about which we know very little in terms of their activity or safety, and the possibility of residual solvents. So the answer is because people make money doing it, and because of these interpretations of the law, in some instances that Delta-8 is legal, people have been taking excess CBD and turning it into Delta-8 as a way to use it and make money with it. Basically, in some instances, because there have been 0.3% Delta-9 restrictions on concentration, people have tried to get around that by spiking things with Delta-8 of synthetic origin. So it's a market issue that is based on what I'm going to say is a misconception of the available law.
And one way or another, we can parse out the law, but more importantly, the answer seems to me to be just straight up prohibition. That if we had federally legalized, cannabis, that the market for Delta-8 would instantaneously disappear, except for the small group of cannabis patients who have unique issues that Delta-8 can address, like the children during chemotherapy that you mentioned earlier, and I think that's important to point out because we will be talking today about a lot of the challenges to using Delta-8 in the market as it presently, functions today. But these questions are only happening, and people who are incorporating Delta-8 into their products, none of this would be happening if it weren't for federal prohibition of the preferred sibling, Delta-9. Would you agree with that?
Yes. Let me state this clearly. The current craze about Delta-8 THC is a byproduct of prohibition.
Excellent. It doesn't get any clearer than that. All right. So that brings us to wanting to understand a bit about how we got here. And so I was fortunate to catch your webinar a couple weeks ago about the history of Delta-8 and its uses. And you've got the historical milestones for Delta-8 in a really nice, tight package now. So I think what I'd like to do at this point would just be to hand you the mic and just let you go for a while. And please just teach us about the historical milestones to Delta-8 that bring us to where we are now.
Sure. Well, we have to go way back to the 4th century on what was then Palestine. There was a skeleton that was found in a cave in Beit Shemesh, which is about midway between Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. In this cave, there was the skeleton of what appeared to be a 14-year-old young woman who apparently died in childbirth. In her pelvis was an undelivered full-term fetus. Next to her, there was this carbonized fragment of material that, when analyzed, showed Delta-8 THC. Now, as I mentioned previously, that's more heat stable than Delta-9. So the fact that it was there indicates that this was psychoactive material that apparently had been burned, and the analysis of the situation was that this cannabis was burned in an effort to aid delivery of the baby, which in this instance didn't work. However, there's been thousands of years of history of successful use of cannabis for this purpose. So that's the first Delta-8 I know about. Then we've got to go clear up to about 1942. There was an American scientist named Roger Adams who did a lot of work in analysis and synthesis related to cannabinoids. Actually, in 1940, he sort of almost got the structure of cannabidiol. So he had a bunch of this and synthesized what he called tetrahydrocannabinols from it, but it wasn't pure. There were at least 2 forms. What he found out was when administered to dogs, this made them wobbly on their feet, what's called static ataxia. Then and earlier, this was a test for cannabis preparations as to their potency. He took some of this material, actually 30 milligrams of what likely at this point was Delta-8 THC, put it in olive oil capsules, and then tested these on convicts in New York, 77 of them. Now, this is interesting because I think people will see the similarities of effects to Delta-9. So with the Delta-8 capsules, they got onset orally in 30 to 90 minutes. It peaked somewhere between 3.5 to 5 hours and was gone after 7 hours. And the effects, again, were quite analogous to Delta-9. They had increased heart rate, a little bit of increased blood pressure, faster breathing. Their eyes got red. They got dry mouth. Some got wobbly on their feet. Recognizing there was a somewhat higher dose, some got anxious, some were euphoric. They talked a lot. It seemed to lower inhibition. Those who were familiar with the term felt high. There were bursts of laughter and some drowsiness. And then they did experiments and showed that with prolonged usage, there was tolerance to these psychoactive effects. Now, interestingly, they made a distinction in humans between inmates and what they called high-ranking individuals and industrialists who also tried this, but the effects were quite the same. So it may show you that businessmen at a high level aren't that different than convicts. But enough political commentary. Subsequently, some of the same material, 15 milligrams of what was likely Delta-8 THC, was again used on convicts in New York. This is part of what's called the LaGuardia Report that came out in 1944. But they used this to test about withdrawal from narcotics, specifically morphine or heroin. And so they compared this 15 milligrams of Delta-8 THC to what was called Magendi's solution, which was just a form of morphine. Anyway, they found that this helped with the withdrawal, reduced the symptoms, and people were able to leave the hospital after treatment, seemingly in better condition than those who got no treatment or got the morphine substitute. So they were able to eat, and some actually gained weight during withdrawal, which is not what we usually expect with opiates. After that, we've got to go clear up to the 1960s. At this point, Professor Meshulam and his colleagues were working out all the structures of cannabis components from hashish. And so in 1963, they figured out the absolute structure of cannabidiol. In 64, Delta-9 THC. In 66, they showed that you could turn cannabidiol into Delta-8 THC through a chemical reaction. So two nasty things heated together with benzene and what's called rho-toluene sulfonic acid, and they could make Delta-8 THC. That and similar schemes have come down to us in the current time as a way to make Delta-8 THC from CBD. And then there were some more experiments that were done. Again, in 66, it was shown that you could find some tiny amounts of Delta-8 in fresh cannabis. The dean of American cannabis studies in the 60s and early 70s with Leo Hollister, he tested Delta-8 THC, 20 and 40 milligrams as compared to 20 milligrams of Delta-9. Interestingly, they put this in chocolate cookies, but the effects were qualitatively very similar. Euphoria, tranquility, difficulty thinking, rapid thoughts, decreased memory. The time frame he got was onset in 30 to 90 minutes orally, peaking after 2.5 to 3 hours, with residual symptoms up to 5 hours. Overall, again, there seemed to be a lower psychoactivity head-to-head, perhaps Delta-8 being about 63% of the potency of Delta-9 as I calculate it, and that might be in keeping with what people have said previously. I previously mentioned the study of Carniol and Carlini in 1973 in Brazil. Their findings were really quite similar to the others. They essentially thought it was about 30% less psychoactive, and very careful studies for the time. Compared to what we're doing now, they're really valid studies. And after that, really not much happened beyond Abrahamoff and Meshulam's study in 1995, clear up until a few years ago when suddenly Delta-8 appeared in great profusion as a way to get rid of surplus CBD.
Right on. Well, then that's actually a great setup. That's where we start set 2. So thank you for that explanation of those historical milestones. And Let's go ahead and take our break, and then when we come back, we'll pick up right here. You are listening to Shaping Fire, and my guest today is neurologist and cannabis researcher, Dr. Ethan Russo. And, without these advertisers, Shaping Fire would not happen. So please support them and let them know you heard them on Shaping Fire. There are so many seed banks nowadays that you really have options in who to choose. Not only that, if you pick the wrong seed bank, you could be in for a really sketchy ride. And that's only one of the reasons I recommend Gaslamp Seeds to my friends and listeners who are looking for a seed bank. You probably already know Gaslamp Seeds as Hembra Genetics. Hembra recently changed their name to Gaslamp Seeds. Gaslamp Seeds is not just another seed bank. Gaslamp is a female-operated boutique cannabis genetics provider that only sells thoughtfully curated seeds from the top names in cannabis breeding. With over 60 breeders and over 1,000 strains to choose from, you will certainly find something you'll love. Gaslamp Seeds has something for everyone, with over 650 feminized strains, 300 regular varieties, and over 200 autoflowers to choose from. Names you can trust, like Compound Genetics, Humboldt Seed Company, Night Owl, In-House, Fast Buds, Gnome Automatics, and Ethos. And we both know that there are other seed banks who will take your money but have no customer service. I invited Gaslamp to advertise on Shaping Fire after hearing so many good stories about them from my friends. They have A-plus customer service with lightning-fast response times. In most cases, Helene and Caitlin will get your order out the same day you place it. Most seed banks are simply not this organized or interested in getting your seeds to you so fast, but Gaslamp Seeds cares. You even get free seeds with every order. Helene and Caitlin get it. They have been in the cannabis growing scene for over a decade. Want some extra freebies? Use the code SHAPINGFIRE, all one word, at checkout, and they will give you an additional set of Gaslamp-provided freebies. That's an extra $30 in free seeds. Buy seeds from good folks who will send you great seeds reliably every time. Visit gaslampseeds.com today. That's Gaslamp Seeds. Fish Poop brand fertilizer is an all-natural fish poop concentrate with nothing added. Real fish poop is extraordinarily complex. Not only are you adding the nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium your plants need to build mass, transport nutrients, and enhance flavor, but fish waste is also packed with biological activity and micronutrients. When you add fish poop to your irrigation water, you are adding life force, probiotics, and active microbes. These microorganisms include a wealth of various bacteria and protozoa which further enhance nutrient availability for the plants. Because plants are limited by the absence of any essential micronutrient, these trace nutrients are the difference between having a decent garden and having a garden that makes you feel really proud of your efforts. Fish poop is a naturally complete solution that fills in the cracks in your fertilizer program to ensure you offer your garden a broad base of nutrients. Not all fish poop is created equally. Most products with added fish waste don't reveal their sources or lab results. Fish Poop brand Fish Poop, however, generates their own fish waste as a byproduct of their organic aquaponics cannabis farm where they raise ornamental koi and tilapia. You are even invited to tour their farm in person or on their YouTube channel to look for yourself. This sort of transparency is wildly rare in the fertilizer market. The folks behind Fish Poop are also lifelong medical cannabis producers who have deep connections in the community, donate more product than they sell, and support cannabis prisoner, veteran, and patient collectives and charities. To get your bottle of pure fish poop, go to fishpoop.com. And to see their entire line of cannabis products, go to ounceofhope.com. That's Fish Poop, brand Fish Poop. Businesses everywhere are striving to reach people through advertising. We all know, though, that trying to reach a cannabis audience with a quality message is pretty difficult. That's why many people choose to advertise on the Shaping Fire podcast. Advertising on this show allows us time to talk about your product, service, or brand in a way that really lets people know what sets your company apart from others. Bold people who own companies know that getting into relationship with their customers is essential, and that is what we offer. We will explain your service or product, what sets it apart as desirable, and help our audience get in contact with you. It's pretty simple, really. Advertising does not have to be all whiz-bang smoke and mirrors. Nowadays, I find that people prefer just to be spoken to calmly, accurately, and with good intentions. If you want to make your own commercial spot, well, you can do that too. During these pandemic days, conventions and cannabis events are pretty poorly attended, but podcast listening is skyrocketing. With a commercial on Shaping Fire, you'll reach your customers in the privacy of their headphones right now, and will continue to reach new listeners as they explore the Shaping Fire back catalog of episodes again and again for years. A spot on Shaping Fire costs less than a printed postcard per person, and the Shaping Fire audience is full of smart cannabis enthusiasts, cultivators, and entrepreneurs who are always curious to learn. Do yourself a solid and contact us today for rates on podcast and Instagram advertising. Email hotspot@shapingfire.com to find out more. Welcome back. You are listening to Shaping Fire. I am your host, Shango Los, and my guest today is neurologist and cannabis researcher, Dr. Ethan Russo. So before the break, we were bringing us up historically to what is happening now, where most folks, or nearly everyone, who is incorporating Delta-8 THC into their products is doing so from Delta-8 that has been synthesized from CBD. And a reminder that the reason why they're not taking it directly from the cannabis plant is because the amounts are so low, so barely there in trace forms, that for both labor and financial reasons, trying to pull it out of a great deal of plant material just doesn't make sense. But because you can synthesize you can synthesize Delta-8 THC from CBD, and we had this huge glut of CBD on the market just 3 years ago now, that the price of the CBD raw bulk material, the bulk plant material, was so low that it made sense to pull out cheap CBD out of these hemp plants and then go to the lab and synthesize it into Delta-8 THC, which even though it's less potent, there is a way to cause a high, and therefore is a way to make money. Ethan, what I'd like you to explain right now, it's kind of like a two-part question. For a lot of us who don't have lab experience, the idea of synthesizing Delta-8 THC from CBD is kind of nothing but words. And so if you could, generally explain what it means to do that in the lab and kind of what that's like, so we can picture that in our heads, what it is to synthesize something. And then the second part, which is part of your answer, is that the point of our concern about Delta-8 is that so many contaminants come along with it from the synthesis process, which then gets passed down to consumers. So this is the crux of the problem, and I'd like you to explain the synthesis and why there are contaminants.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's an important question. So let's say that we have a bunch of starting material. So this would be crystalline CBD that originally came from the plant, or even could be from a synthetic source. So first, this would be dissolved in some kind of organic solvent. Now, they often will use things like hexane, which is something you'd find in gasoline. It's not something you'd want to ingest. Then it's heated in the presence of an acid, and that closes a ring on cannabidiol and produces Delta-8 THC. So that sounds fine, except then you've got to get rid of the solvent, presumably with some kind of drying or evaporation technique. But there always could be residuals, and that's a source of toxicity. But the real problem here is this isn't a one-to-one proposition. In other words, you don't get all the CBD turned only into Delta-8 THC. Rather, there are all these other things. Now, we're going to get into some fancy names here. Delta-4,8 iso-THC, 9-ethoxyhexahydrocannabinol, and even getting new things that hadn't been discovered before, like isotetrahydrocannabifuran. So these are things about which we know little or nothing. It may be that some of these substances are okay. It may be that they're not. They are potentially toxic. Some could be actually more psychoactive than Delta-9 THC. And, we'll probably get into some other nasties that have been found in Delta-8 products. But the bottom line is this. Basically, it is extremely unlikely that any commercial product with Delta-8 in it is going to only have that. Will have these potentially toxic byproducts and potentially toxic solvent residues. So basically, if you're using these products, it's a crapshoot as to what's really in there and what bad effects they might have, either acutely or particularly if taken on a chronic basis.
In most cases, product manufacturers who are using Delta-8, they get a test done that's perhaps needed for their state, but one way or another, there's a test done at some point of what the isolate is that they are purchasing or making, and it's done, and they're like, oh, it looks good. But isn't the science that to find any of these contaminants, you actually have to be using standards to actually see them, and since there is all of this, chemical static in the isolate that is the resultant, that many people may actually think they're using an air quotes clean isolate of Delta-8, but the costs are so preventative to check for all of the toxic items that kind of research is not being done on their products.
Very likely not. So what you said is quite right. So there is this blip on a screen, whatever kind of analytical test is being done. Well, that's going to remain unknown unless you have a standard, a pure chemical that you've used in your analysis that tells you what it is. And for some of these compounds, there aren't any standards. So in the analytical studies that have been done, they figure it out using advanced instrumentation and comparison with the literature. But, these are just not necessarily available in your friendly neighborhood lab.
Mm-hmm. I have struggled a bit with the idea of Delta-8 being natural or a synthetic, because synthetic and natural both seem to be inexact words. And I originally learned about Delta-8 as a synthetic, something that is not naturally occurring. But the more I speak with scientists, they say what you have said, which is there's such a trace amount that it does occur in the plant. We're not exactly sure how it occurs in the plant, but it's there in trace amounts. But to say that Delta-8 is then natural seems to be a bit of a misnomer, because that's not the Delta-8 that is used in the market. What's used for product manufacturing is I dare say always going to be Delta-8 that's been synthesized from cannabidiol, which is synthetic because it's not naturally occurring. And so I just wanted to hear whatever your thoughts were on these messy use of synthetic versus natural for in an isolate?
Right. Well, to keep it quite simple, basically any consumer product advertising itself as containing Delta-8 THC is of synthetic origin and subject to all the caveats and warnings that we've already discussed. And it gets worse from there. Some of these products may contain Delta-8 THC acetate. There's a whole problem with this group of compounds, the esters. When these are vaporized, they can produce something called ketones, which are toxic to the lungs and have been associated with this problem with the lungs called EVALI. Which is an acronym for something very ominous called e-cigarette or vaping product use associated lung injury. People may have heard of this term in relation to the vitamin E acetate scandal of a few years ago, where vitamin E acetate was put in vape pens as sort of a carrier. It had a consistency that was sort of like cannabis concentrates, and it was put in vape pens, but a number of people were hospitalized and there were some deaths due to pulmonary damage from this kind of compound. The same thing could happen with any of these acetates that are sometimes seen as toxic byproducts of Delta-8 THC production. So actually, Delta-8 THCO acetate has been demonstrated on vape pens, something called Blue Dream. This is shown by Benowitz et al. In an article earlier this year. And they pointed out how this Delta-8 THC acetate, when subjected to heat, produced this ketone, which again is the lung-damaging compound. So the same thing potentially could happen with any Delta-8 vape pen if it had similar contaminants.
Right on. So let's tease out that nuance a little bit, because I think that it's the crux of this, essentially the entire episode, that Delta-8, in a perfect world where it was isolated properly in a lab and then after the fact was cleaned up to remove contaminants, which is a very lengthy and arduous process and takes, advanced skills. That Delta-8 as a medicine does have applications and does cause, a 60% euphoria effect, 60% of what Delta-9 does. However, that's not the world we live in. The world we live in is that folks without enough experience are isolating Delta-8, not cleaning it up afterwards, maybe don't have the experience to know everything that they need to be pulling out, don't have the budget or the lab to identify the toxic contaminants and remove them, and then this is the Delta-8 that is being dumped onto the market, that's being synthesized from CBD, from hemp, from the last 3 years. And this is what the problem is. So it's not scientifically true Delta-8. The problem is in the reality that people aren't putting out pure Delta-8, and it's actually got all this these extra contaminants in it.
Yeah, quite right. The way I'd put it succinctly is Delta-8 THC, the molecule or compound, is not the problem. The problem is how that Delta-8 THC is produced. And again, the toxic byproducts and solvent residues. So, again, don't blame the compound. Compound's all right, but how it's made and available to consumers is the problem, and potentially a very big one.
There was a popular study from 2021 that looked at this case of Delta-8 from CBD being sprayed on Delta-9 flower to make it more potent, and then I believe subsequently they were taking products from the licensed market where there should not be Delta-8. And there were all of these products that had Delta-8 in it, kind of like to fortify the experience of the regular Delta-9. So it's like a fortified vitamin or a fortified alcohol or something. It's like we want to make it more strong, and so we're gonna add something extra. And so people are adding Delta-8 and not mentioning it on the label because it's in most states it's not supposed to be in their licensed market, but they add Delta-8 so that their product has what they think is an improved experience. Can you explain what the downside would be for people to be buying products that have got Delta-8 in it without their knowledge?
Well, it's an unconscionable practice, and I would condemn anyone who engages in that kind of activity. But beyond that, again, it's a matter of not knowing what you're getting, the likelihood of overdose, if in a vape pen, the possibilities of lung damage. And, it's been demonstrated. There have actually been studies that show that use rates of Delta-8 products are way higher in states that have restrictive cannabis policies as opposed to those that have freer access to natural cannabis compounds. And again, this stuff is not without risks. There was a study earlier this year, Simon et al. There's a reporting system at the Food and Drug Administration for non-prescription drugs. It's called the FAERS system. And they've had a massive increase in reports associated with Delta-8 products. Just to give a rundown, 33 deaths attributed to Delta-8 products, 49 hospitalizations, 109 serious reports, 41 non-serious. And this one will surprise people. There were more respiratory issues, problems with the lungs that were reported for Delta-8 THC products than any cannabis or hemp product. Mm-hmm. So that puts it in context. These things are not without risk. So this is quite in contrast to the claims that have sometimes been made. There was a paper that was published, wouldn't have gotten past me if I reviewed it, but in 2022, Kruger and Kruger published a study. It was just an online survey of people using Delta-8 products. And they reported that I don't know how they made their comparisons. It wouldn't be scientific, but they reported Delta-8 was less intense, produced relaxation and euphoria, that it relieved pain, but also was associated with short-term memory impairment. There was a comment from one consumer that got in the title of the paper, and the quote was, "Delta-8 feels like Delta-9's nicer young sibling." And it's just not borne out by the figures. And the conclusion of the article was, quote, "Delta-8 THC may provide much of the experiential benefits of Delta-9 THC with lesser adverse effects." That's just plain wrong, and never should have been in a published scientific article. And I won't cast aspersions on the publisher, but I could.
And I think that this adds a lot to the confusion that we see amongst consumers about Delta-8. I kind of came into the Delta-8 understanding being prejudiced against Delta-8, I got to admit, because I was only ever seeing it in really low quality, unlicensed market products that were very low priced in states where cannabis wasn't legal. And let's be clear off the top that the fact that it's unlicensed doesn't actually bother me. We talk a lot about individual patient freedoms and to grow your own on this show. But what does get me is when a product is of crappy quality, period, whether it's in the licensed or in the unlicensed market. And so I would, when I first started seeing Delta-8, it was in, these states and $10 vape cartridges in really, bad packaging. And you could just tell like, oh man, somebody's going to get really sick from this stuff. And then they did, and so certainly there are products in the unlicensed market that are quality, but certainly that's not most of them. Most of them are of low quality, and because there are papers like the one you just referred to that product manufacturers can grasp onto and say, hey, look, here's a study that says that, it's safe and good. It creates enough confusion in the market where people aren't educated. And so they buy what they can afford. And so these products are finding themselves more into states that are not legal, and then people who are low income, which is, such a drag. I also found it interesting that there's an ASTN white paper in 2021 pointing out that the instructions for synthesizing Delta-8 are easily found on YouTube, but it's not as simple as it's often presented on YouTube. Most people don't have the skills to do it safely, and the study says it results in wildly unintended consequences. So are those unintended consequences the same toxic components that we've already referred to, or is something even further than that?
No, that's it. Basically they referred in that white paper to acetic acid available in your kitchen. Translating, that means vinegar. So there would be ways of making this with vinegar and heat. But again, I don't trust a lab to do this properly. Why would we have any inkling that someone doing this as a kitchen chemist would have better luck in what they produce? No one should ever try this.
Right on. So to wrap us up here in set 2, and I know we're putting a pretty sharp point on this, but I don't think that we can put too sharp of a point on it. A lot of people say, hey, Delta-8 is in the plant. We've been using the plant for, thousands of years. Delta-8 has a natural origin, and therefore, and natural products are safe, and therefore they say that Delta-8 in their products is fine. But that's just not the right way to think about it, is it? No. All right. So let's wrap up here. In set 3, we're going to start talking about some of the unexpected attributes of Delta-8, and some of the interesting questions about Delta-8 and how to think about it that just haven't fit into the show so far. It's going to be kind of a hodgepodge of interesting Delta-8 topics, I guess. So let's go ahead and take our second short break and be right back. You are listening to Shaping Fire, and my guest today is neurologist and cannabis researcher, Dr. Ethan Russo. As cannabis regulations become more demanding and consumers become more educated, it is increasingly important to avoid the use of chemical pesticides when cultivating cannabis. Beneficial insects have been used for decades by the greenhouse vegetable and ornamental plant industry, and today many cannabis cultivators are moving from sprays and chemicals to beneficial insects. Copert has the beneficial insects, mites and nematodes, microbials, sticky cards, and air distribution units you need to partner with nature to defend your garden. Whether you manage acres of canopy or have a simple grow tent in your home, Copert is ready to help answer your questions and help you transition away from chemical sprays towards clean and natural solutions. Since 1967, Copert has assisted growers in identifying pests and devising reliable solutions while providing healthy insects and mites that will protect your yield. Since the 1990s, Copert has been a leader in cannabis pest and disease control worldwide and have highly trained consultants to assist you in Canada and the United States from coast to coast. With their global network of grower support, Copert can help. Visit Copert.com, choose your country, and get detailed information. That's Copert, Koppert.com. For the most up-to-date cannabis-related biological control information, you can also check their Instagram at Copert Canada. You know getting away from pesticides is good for health and good for business, and Copert is ready to help. Visit Koppert.com today. Sometimes the topics I want to share with you are far too brief for an entire Shaping Fire episode. In those instances, I post them to Instagram. I invite you to follow my 2 Instagram profiles and participate online. The Shaping Fire Instagram has follow-up posts to Shaping Fire episodes, growing and processing best practices, product trials, and, of course, gorgeous flower photos. The Shango Los Instagram follows my travels on cannabis garden tours, my successes and failures in my own garden, insights and best practices from personal grows everywhere, and always gorgeous flower photos. On both profiles, the emphasis is on sharing what I've learned in a way that you can replicate it in your own garden, your own hash lab, or for your own cannabinopathic health. So I encourage you to follow at Shaping Fire and at Shango Los and join our online community on Instagram. The cannabis seed market is filled with big name and hype breeders fighting to get your attention. And occasionally you discover a breeder who is breeding because it is the only thing they care to do, and they would be doing it even if they never made a dime. That's my friend Craig Hartsaw, who makes seeds as Magnetic Genetics. Craig comes from 5 generations of farmers and is earning his master's degree in horticulture right now. He's been growing cannabis for 15 years and been breeding for 9. He hasn't sold many seeds because he really isn't a sales guy, but I've personally been growing his seeds for years, and I know I can always rely on his seeds to germinate, thrive, and smell and taste great. I suggested to Craig that he should probably sell some seeds and asked if he had enough stockpiled to bother. Much to my shock, he was sitting on 5 full menus in cold storage that he produced in the last 2 years and hadn't even tried to sell any of them. He was simply too busy breeding. Well, we, his friends, convinced him to make his damn seeds available to the people, and now they are. For the first time anywhere, you can now buy Magnetic Genetic seeds at Neptune Seed Bank and on Strainly.io. Neptune Seed Bank has just picked up Magnetic Genetics for a trial to gauge your interest. They are carrying 3 strains from his Mean Mug, Prominence, and Terpenado menus, which are exclusive to Neptune. It's an easy way to score his seeds. You can pick up those menus plus his Hillbilly Skunk and Candy Breath crosses and more on his profile page on Strainly.io. If you want very affordable seeds that are exceptional quality with rare terpene profiles from a good guy, go to NeptuneSeedBank.com or Strainly.io. Sometimes it is fun to buy the hype thing from the brand you admire, but when you're ready to buy the strain you'll love from an obscure mad scientist, you're ready for Magnetic Genetics. MagneticGenetics.org and on Instagram, Magnetic Genetics. Welcome back. You are listening to Shaping Fire. I'm your host, Shango Los, and my guest today is neurologist and cannabis researcher, Dr. Ethan Russo. So here in the last set, we're going to talk mostly about things that didn't really fit in the rest of the show, and there's some really interesting stuff about Delta-8 that we haven't touched on yet. And the first thing I want to talk about, Ethan, is that, we mentioned early way back in the first set that Delta-8 works effectively as an antiemetic in kids who are experiencing chemotherapy, meaning that it decreases their nausea. Have we found anything else that Delta-8 can do? Well, I guess anything at all, because Delta-9 may actually be better than Delta-8 for this. But have we found anything that Delta-8 can do that naturally occurring Delta-9 THC and the other naturally occurring cannabinoids don't do better? Is there anything unique that Delta-8 can do that the other cannabinoids can't do?
Yes, and it would be its stability to heat, as demonstrated in the ancient sample. And I suppose there could be some jurisdictions around the world where they had a law that specifically cited Delta-9 THC and didn't cite Delta-8, and it might be possible there to use Delta-8 preferentially. But, that's a legal point, not a medical point. So its thermal stability is its main selling point.
Is the thermal stability something that is actually a health benefit, or is that more because it's more thermally stable, it makes it a good choice for some particular pharmaceutical products that have got to be heated?
It would be that kind of situation or shelf life issues, but I don't see this as being commercially developed in any capacity.
Meaning now or in the future or both?
Yeah, because to make a Delta-8 prescription product, it's going to have to go through years of testing and hundreds of millions of dollars in expenditure to get it through phase 1 to 3 clinical trials. I don't see anybody doing that.
Because the promise of it doesn't seem to be justify that much time and resources.
Yeah, 2 points. One is it wouldn't be worth the investment. And 2, it's never going to do what herbal cannabis in a proper preparation can do. So this would be the place where I typically invoke the entourage effect.
Go ahead. Why don't you go ahead and invoke it for those who aren't familiar with it?
There's nothing that pure THC, whether Delta-9 or Delta-8 can do that can't be done better by a properly constituted herbal cannabis preparation. We really benefit from having additional cannabinoids and terpenoids that reduce the side effect profile of THC in either form. And it makes for a better, more tolerable, and more effective medicine.
Excellent. We always love to support the whole plant medicine thinking here on the show. So, during Shaping Fire episode 14, all the way back 5 years ago with Dr. Greg Girdman, we discussed how synthetic cannabinoids can sometimes be used in the lab as a tool. So not as something that a human is actually going to ingest for a medical reason, but something that can be used in the lab as a tool to do, one or other experiment or process. Would you explain briefly how synthetic cannabinoids can be useful in a lab setting? And then also whether you're aware of any useful tool that Delta-8 has become in the lab?
Okay. Well, there have actually been hundreds of synthetic cannabinoids that have been used in the lab. Some of these are extremely potent as compared to Delta-9 THC. Those can be useful in pointing out pathways or the patterns of the receptors in a given organ, especially the brain. So they're just tools that are used that way, and they're often used in animal studies. Believe it or not, it's easier to acquire a lot of these synthetics than it is to get permission to use Delta-9 in such experiments. But we have to be very careful. Rats are not humans, and in particular, there have been some distinctions in the affinity of Delta-8 for cannabinoid receptors in certain species of animals as compared to humans. I hate to say this, but you can only learn so much from animal studies. That's true. There are distinct differences, and any such literature has to be read with that in mind, that that's interesting, but it may not translate to human clinical use.
Do you think that there are folks that are using Delta-8 as a tool in the lab, or is that not necessarily one of the synthetic cannabinoids that has use in a lab in that way?
It has been used. I wouldn't say a great deal. But again, it might have to do with things like its stability as compared to Delta-9.
Right on. So in some of the studies that have grabbed products from the licensed market, as well as our general awareness of products in the unlicensed market, we find that some people will fail drug tests because they've had Delta-8 with Delta-8 THC, and folks think that, oh, it's got Delta-8, it doesn't have, real cannabis in it, if you will, these people will say. And so they think it's safe to use, but yet they still fail drug tests for, their trucking job or whatever. So will you just explain briefly why Delta-8 is not safe for people who have to take drug tests?
Sure. As we said in the beginning, the only difference is where this double bond is that makes a difference between Delta-8 and Delta-9. So in analytical assays for urine testing, metabolites of THC, they're going to show up anyway. So the bottom line is, if you're getting urine testing for your job, don't use Delta-8. Simple. Right
on. Easy and to the point. A lot of people who are looking to defend Delta-8, as it's commercially made right now as an agricultural product, they say, listen, it's an agricultural product like anything else, and we should be allowed to use it. But on your webinar the other day, it was mentioned why, Delta-8 doesn't make sense to consider it an agricultural product. And would you repeat that analysis?
Sure. It had its first origin in a plant grown in the ground, presumably, although some Delta-8 may be made from synthetic CBD. But once it gets into the lab and subjected to these chemical transmogrifications, it's not natural, it's not an agricultural product, it's a synthetic product, and one that invariably is contaminated.
Right on. So is there a scientific threshold point where a molecule that started out in a plant is now considered a synthetic? Because I'm figuring that somewhere along that chain of synthesis, it's officially no longer an agricultural product. Does that threshold exist, or is that more subjective?
Anytime you've changed one thing into something else, that's no longer agricultural.
Right on. Fair enough. We've had you on Shaping Fire before to talk about cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome. And this is the likelihood that someone will be especially sensitive to cannabis, causing a whole range of negative symptoms. Have we seen cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome from being caused by Delta-8 products?
Yes. In 2021, there was a case report. This is a woman who'd had prior gastric surgery and came in with nausea and vomiting. So she got a CAT scan to make sure that nothing was wrong with the surgery. And her nausea and vomiting wasn't responding to the usual approaches and drugs that they used. It turned out she'd been using Delta-8 THC gummies. They suspected she had cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome, and then responded to drugs that seemed to work better there, specifically haloperidol, which is a major tranquilizer, and capsaicin ointment on the skin. So cannabinoid hyperemesis syndrome will be caused by anything, whether Delta-9, Delta-8, or synthetic cannabinoids that are stimulating the CB1 receptor, the main psychoactive receptor for cannabinoids. Mm-hmm. So yes, Delta-8 can be associated with CHS.
Right on. Thank you. So as we wrap up here at the end of set 3, I think I want to wrap up by reading a couple of quotes from the C. Hudala study from 2021. We believe in unicorns and Delta-8 from the cannabis scientist, and then I'm going to ask you a question, and we'll wrap up here. So here are a couple quotes from that paper. The problem is not with Delta-8, but the unregulated distribution of synthetic contaminated products. At least Walter White was a chemistry teacher. Delta-8 has become a money printing machine. But when I show producers what it is in their sample, they don't stop making it and they don't stop distributing it. They just go to another lab who will not acknowledge the contaminants found. This really points to, so I'm no longer quoting anymore. This is my voice now. This really points to the shisty nature of a particular section of the unlicensed market, but even some of the licensed market, because we know Delta-8 has snuck into state level legal markets. And let's finish with this, Ethan. I know you're very passionate about this as a medical doctor and also as a cannabis researcher in search for the truth. For folks that are making these Delta-8 products that we know are all coming from synthesis from CBD, what message would you have for them in encouragement to perhaps reconsider their approach?
Again, I would state that there's nothing that Delta-8 does that can't be done more safely and effectively with a natural cannabis product. Now, that may not be available to everyone, but, I hope that the laws will change and that we see this commerce in Delta-8 disappear, because, to repeat what I said earlier, the Delta-8 craze is a byproduct of prohibition.
Well said. And at the end, this problem sits at the feet of our legislators who are choosing to drag their feet instead of taking real legalization action. Well, thank you, Ethan. It's always a pleasure to have you on Shaping Fire, and especially with such a nuanced topic as this that is just not getting enough attention. I appreciate you taking your time and your expertise and going through it with us, so that we too, as cannabis enthusiasts, can understand the nuances and use it in our own lives as well as the people who we care for. So thank you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
So, my friends, if you are interested in learning more about Dr. Russo, there's a few ways to do that. First and foremost, I highly recommend you check out Ethan Russo's library of work and research at ethanrusso.org, and then click on the library tab. You can also find a link to this on the shapingfire.com website for today's episode. You can also learn about Ethan Russo's work bringing cannabis into legal and healthful cannabis products and different projects at credo-science.com. That's credo-science.com. And then finally, if you have a burning question or a comment that is only going to be for Ethan Russo, you can email him at ethanrusso@comcast.net. Now, be realistic. Ethan, for all these years, he does his best to get back with everybody, but he is, still an active researcher, and he's flying around the world to give lectures. So it might take him a while to get back with you. So be realistic. But I think he does a pretty good job of getting back with everybody. Finally, if you want to learn more from Dr. Russo, he has joined us several times on Shaping Fire over the last 5 years, and perhaps one of these will interest you. All the way back 5 years ago, episode 22 on treating traumatic brain injury with cannabis and psilocybin mushrooms. Episodes 11 and 27 about his famous research papers on cannabinoids and terpenoids. Episode number 67 about treating migraines with mushrooms and cannabis. Episode 80 on cannabis hyperemesis syndrome. Episode 83 on cannabigerol, CBG. And then recently and very heartfully, episode 103 in a memorial episode about the life's work of the very respected Dr. Raphael Mechoulam. And of course, on there's the Shaping Fire sessions, a 10-part series on the Shaping Fire YouTube channel. You can find more episodes of the Shaping Fire podcast and subscribe to the show at shapingfire.com and wherever you get your podcasts. If you enjoyed the show, we'd really appreciate it if you would leave a positive review of the podcast wherever you download. Your review will help others find the show so they can enjoy it too. On the Shaping Fire website, you can also subscribe to the newsletter for insights into the latest cannabis news, exclusive videos, and giveaways. On the Shaping Fire website, you will also find transcripts of today's podcast as well. Be sure to follow on Instagram for all original content not found on the podcast. That's at Shaping Fire and at Shango Los on Instagram. Be sure to check out the Shaping Fire YouTube channel for exclusive interviews, farm tours, and cannabis lectures. Does your company want to reach our national audience of cannabis enthusiasts? Email hotspot@shapingfire.com to find out how. Thanks for listening to Shaping Fire. I've been your host, Shango Los.